Thanks everyone for joining. Today, I want to talk about securing API management with Azure Application Gateway. First, this is kind of what API management is, just to get started. I talked about API management in our last tech talk. This time, just as a reminder, the API management is or has like three main components. One of them is the developer portal, in which developers can sign up to APIs and get their subscription keys and try. It's like a Swagger, like Swagger. You also have the management plane, in which you can manage API management. It's an API. And finally, you have the gateway, which is what consumers point to when they want to access the APIs themselves. And securing API management, in order to secure API management, you need several components like app gateway, and it's a different gateway from this one in the screenshot. It's not the API management gateway. I mean, app gateway, Azure App Gateway. You also need Azure Application Firewall. You need subnets, which we are going to review in a minute. But think of this as there's a lot of components involved. But think of this. I heard this phrase. It's like putting Legos together. There are a lot of components that need to talk to each other, and it's actually kind of fun. Now, this is a little more related to creating infrastructure, which some of us may not do, right? But in the end, we're all like software engineers, and creating virtual networks or creating subnets is something that we learn at school and possibly used at some point in our career. So let's switch to, and those are some of the things that we'll use, VNets and subnets as well. Moving on, this is a screenshot of how to secure. This is from Microsoft. How to secure API management from how to make it private. Let's review it. So, for example, you have API management over here. It's inside a virtual network, which is this icon. This is the virtual network. You have, for example, some of your resources or dependencies may be in other networks, and for that you'll need to do VNet peering. The API management needs to run in a subnet with very specific requirements, like the minimum. What is it called? Like, so well, it says here subnet size is 29. Some of you might remember this from if you have worked with subnets in other projects. And in order to access API management, a component that is not shown here is App Gateway, which runs with Web Application Firewall V2. There are multiple versions. Microsoft recommends using V2, and you also need DNS, different FQDN, a fully qualified domain name, I think, FQDN, yeah, for API management. One of them is for the API, the gateway itself. The other one is for the developer portal, the second one. The third one is for the management API. And the last one, I think this is something related to Git and that repository, which lives inside API management. But the last one, we can ignore it for now. And this DNS, you have two options. You can use self-signed certificates, or you can use real certificates. Of course, for production, you'll need certificates signed by a trusted authority. But if you have like other environments, you could use self-signed certificates, which is not really ideal because you want at least your staging or your test environment to be the same as production. But you have the option to use self-signed certificates for that. Let's continue. Oh, in this case, for example, the only public endpoint visible to end users is the app gateway. Since API management is running in a virtual network, you don't have the, I mean, you can't access it from the internet because it's in a VNet. So it has a private IP address, something like 10.0. Something, which is again a private IP address. And if you have this, well, you could also have like a, I think it's called a jump server. It's basically a virtual machine running here in case you want to test something. Like while setting it up, you might want to make sure that everything is working. And for that, you need a virtual machine, right? Because again, it's protected inside a VNet and you can't access it from outside except through the gateway, application gateway. Let's continue. So what is application gateway? Just like a very simple explanation. It's a layer 7 load balancer, but it offers more capabilities. It has a 99.95% uptime if you are using only one region. If you use multiple regions, it increases to 99.99% uptime. It has an integrated web application firewall and can make routing decisions. This is another screenshot from Microsoft. This is kind of what App Gateway would do. For example, you have your users, and if you have resources in the backend resources, you could put Application Gateway in front of them, and this could be like a front end for like a filter for the requests, and it can make routing decisions. Like if a request has certain format, it would redirect to the images folder, and if it has like another format, it would redirect to the video server pool, which could be other servers. Another component is web application firewall, and this works hand in hand with App Gateway. It's a cloud native application firewall. It's highly available. It provides auto scaling, and it's fully platform managed, meaning you don't have to worry about the hardware. And it has, you can configure rules, exclusion lists. So it's a really great way to protect your resources. And in this case, you could have your web application firewall work with your app gateway, and it could protect you from SQL injection attacks or like crawlers, web crawlers, if you want to block those types of requests. And any valid request, it would only allow valid requests to go through your resources in your backend. Now, the prerequisites for doing this is that you will need certificates for your custom domain. And I provide here a link which gives you like a lot of details on how to create the certificates. Again, this is in case you want to use self-signed certificates only. If you want to use certificates signed by a trusted authority, you'll have to provision them, and you can, I think you can even use Azure for that, but if not, you can buy them. And I have somewhere here. Well, I'll get to this. I'll get to this in a minute, but you'll need certificates, at least 3 of them, for your API, not App Gateway again, for your API management, for your portal, and for your developer portal, and for your management API. You also need to create a virtual network with at least 3 subnets. There's only 2 here, but there's always a default subnet. You'll need to add a subnet for API management, which will need a network security group, and you also need a subnet for App Gateway. You also need to create, as part of the prerequisites, an Azure Key Vault to store your certificates. You also need to create a user managed identity for App Gateway to access Key Vault. You also need to create the API management instance. Of course, this is what we are protecting. You'll need to create your custom domains and potentially create a private DNS zone because inside your virtual network, you can reach anything through IP addresses, right? But sometimes you might want to use like api.mydomain.com or management.mydomain.com. And let me go back. And this is for things like this, for being able to write this in a browser or in other places. You will need a private DNS zone. And in this case, it's using the domain from Azure. So yeah, I mean, this is not like the best example, but in the end, you'll be using very specific domains. I'll show you in a minute. Now let's review the setup that I have here. I'm using my personal environment. My domain is R-Ortiz demo, and the name of the resource group where I put everything is called POC. It's not very creative. It's just a proof of concept. Let's review this. Let's look at, for example, the virtual network first. And the great thing is that provisioning this whole environment, it takes, I don't know, maybe like 2 or 3 hours tops. But you have to consider that provisioning some of the resources takes a while. For example, provisioning API management takes between 15 and 45 minutes. So that's really slow. But overall, provisioning all this is very fast. And this is one of the like the goodnesses, I guess, of Azure, that it allows you to manage your infrastructure very easily. You don't have to worry about the actual hardware or the updates, software updates. You just provision everything through clicks and you have it like right there within seconds. Let's talk about the virtual network. Let's open it up. And in the case of the virtual network, let's focus on first on the subnets. There we go. I mentioned that we needed 3 subnets. There's the default subnet, which comes out of the box. You have your subnet for API for the gateway, for the application gateway. And you also have your subnet for API management. In this case, you can see I'm using this address space. But for example, the app gateway, I think you can switch it to 29. And for API management, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think it can be, you don't need like 251 IPs. It can be lower. And as you can see, this is attached to a security group. Microsoft provides an example of the ideal security group. This is a security group that comes out of the box. I'm gonna click it. This is another Azure resource that you need to provision. And actually, I opened a couple of ports there. And out of the box, you get these 3 inbound rules and these 3 outbound rules, which you cannot modify. Let's go back. We're talking about the subnets. Let's look at is there something else here? Yeah, let's look at the diagram. It's a great way to visually see what's going on. For example, you have your virtual network here, which is the main resource that we are looking at. You have 3 subnets. One of them has a security group attached to it. And over here, you can see that we have a public IP address. Wait, that's a virtual machine. Sorry, it's a VM. You have a VM attached to it. Sorry, this is the VM. The first one is the virtual machine. And the last one is an IP address attached to the virtual machine. And this diagram is very helpful because again, you can visually know how your virtual network, which components your virtual network has. You also have the possibility of configuring peerings, which I didn't get to in this proof of concept. And you also have DDoS, distributed denial of service protection here. Let's see if I have something connected devices. I should. Yeah, so as you can see, we have the application gateway as a connected device. So let's continue to another component of this architecture. Let's switch to API management itself. Let's look at how that's configured. If we go to the network section over here, you can see that we have the possibility to not have a virtual network or have it configured as external or internal. I recall that external, it's this in my case, it's not external. When you have the external option selected, that's because you will not get a private IP. So that's why it has to be internal. You need to have a private IP and you link your API management service to a virtual network and a subnet as well. And if we go to the custom domains, you'll see here that I'm pulling certificates, self-signed certificates from Key Vault. My gateway runs in api.rortsdemo.com. My management endpoint runs at management.rortsdemo.com. And the developer portal, the subdomain is portal. And this is the equivalent of, let me go back to the presentation, of these URLs that API management provides out of the box, but I wanted to use my own domains. And it's important to know that API management runs in the same URL. So that's why you need to use subdomains to, let me say that again. API management runs in the subdomain, but it has several endpoints running in the same domain. So that's why you need to add subdomains to differentiate them. You cannot access API management just through an IP because it's going to, it wouldn't know if you are asking for the developer portal or for the management API or for the gateway. So this is what you need to do in API management: configure your custom domains and pull them from Key Vault. Let's go back over here. We already reviewed the security group. Let's look at the virtual machine. In this case, I have the virtual machine configured for RDP connections, but ideally you want to use Bastion. Bastion allows you to connect to the virtual machine, to a virtual machine running in a VNet without having to expose a public IP address. That way, it's more secure. But in my case, since this is my personal environment, Bastion is expensive, so I didn't configure it. I'm using RDP, which is free except for the IP address. I don't remember how much Bastion costs, but I was using the free trial. I ran out of credits, and right now I'm in the pay-as-you-go version. This is what the API. Sorry, this is what the VM. This is the ideal configuration for the virtual machine to use Bastion. Let's see what else we have here. I'm leaving API app gateway until the end because it's the component that you need to configure the most from an infrastructure point of view. We also have the the private DNS on this. Yeah, this is where I wanted to click. Let me open it up. This allows you to have like a DNS server, and it takes seconds to configure. So for example, this is my main domain, and all that you need to do is define the virtual network link, which I have over here. Because since this is private, it needs to be attached to a virtual network. So I'm linking it to my API-VNet. And I also added a few record sets of type A. And I point them to the private IP address of API management. And some of them are allow auto registration and others don't. And adding record sets is very simple. You just type the name, the type of the record, and the IP address. And if this was not private, if this was public, this is something that you would configure like at godaddy.com or like whatever. I don't know what they are called, but domain name servers you have for your domain configured. So let's close this one. And I think it's time to go to application gateway. Let me switch very quickly to the presentation. Let's see if there was something else I wanted to configure. No, sorry, to review. No, this was the last item. So, okay, in this case, let's, I forgot to show you something about API management, actually. API management, if I can find it, this one. Yeah, you'll see here that we have a private IP address, 10.1.1.5, along with the public IP address. But since this is attached to a virtual network, this is not going to work. The public IP address is not accessible at all. So you need to use a private IP address. Let's go to the application gateway now. This is the last component that I want to talk about. In this case, it's already configured. So let's review some of the configuration. The first item that we should look at is, hold on, I can find it. What is that? I thought it was, I'll find it in a minute, but let's start with the listeners. So our listeners, I have 3 of them, one for each of our subdomains. For example, one for management, one for portal, and one for API. And they are configured kind of the same way. So we'll just look at one of them. And I'm gonna open it. And the listener in this case, it's public and it's running in port 443, means HTTPS. I'm using an existing certificate for this. Now, in this case, I'm pulling the certificate from Key Vault. If I wanted to create a new one, I have the option to choose it from Key Vault. I give it a name. I select Key Vault. Well, the managed identity first, which I forgot to cover. But you need, as I mentioned in one of the slides, you need a managed identity in order for App Gateway to access the certificates. So in this case, it's already created. It's selected by default. And you define your Key Vault, and then you define your certificate that you want to use. And in our case, we have multiple domains running, multiple subdomains running, and that's why it has to be multi-site and single. If it's basic, you don't have the options to choose the host name, so that's why it needs to be multi-site and single. And we have an associated rule to this, which is rule 02. You probably want to give it a different name, but this is only a proof of concept. Let's open it up. And rule 02 is this one. And what it does is that it's attached to a listener, and it allows you to define a backend target, which points to a backend pool. And I will review the backend pool in a minute. It's very simple, but it tells you which resource you want is your backend for when someone goes, when a request triggers this API, this listener. And if you recall, this listener is for api.rortsdemo.com. That's what it knows. So let me close this one. And I said that I was gonna talk about the backend pools, and should be this one. And this is our main backend pool. It has the IP address of API management, and it lets you, or you could use the fully qualified domain name if you had other type of resources. In our case, our target is API management 10.1.1.5, And actually all the listeners point to this backend pool because management, the management API, the developer portal, and the API gateway all run in the same API. But what allows you to differentiate them is the subdomain. That's how API management knows what you're trying to reach. And that's defined in the listener through the rules. Now you also have health probes. This allows you to know if the endpoint is healthy or not. If I go to backend health, and this takes a few seconds or probably longer than that to load, but it tells you if your backend services are healthy. In this case, you see the 3 servers, API gateway, the portal, and management, and all of them are healthy. So let's check how that's configured. I went. You need to go to health. You need to go to health probes, and at the health probes, it's very simple, and pretty much all you have to define is the host and the path that tells you if it's healthy or not. And these paths come out of the box. For example, for the API, you have your status endpoint. For the portal, you have the sign in endpoint because that's where developers can go to sign in. And for the management, you have the service status endpoint that comes out of the box again. If you want to check if the endpoint is healthy or not, and you configure the interval, the timeout, and the unhealthy threshold for that. There's a lot of configuration going on, but basically, App Gateway has backend pools, backend settings, your listeners, and your rules, and your health probes, and that's it. You can also configure routing here, which I don't have configured, but I think that's in the listeners. Let's open one. No, it's not here. Maybe in the rules, maybe. I want to show you how that works. If I can find it. No, there's a path. If it's not here, then let me try one last thing. And if not, we'll skip it. Where was that? Maybe here. No. Anyway, I'm pretty sure it was in the listeners, but you have the possibility to configure. For example, if you see, and let me switch to the presentation. Something like this. If you have /images, you can configure that somewhere here. Yeah, no, I don't recall, but you can configure images to go to a certain backend, and you can configure, so if the incoming request has /video, sorry, you can configure it to go to other backend servers. We're almost done. Let's review the Key Vault certificates. To complete the presentation, it's in the proof of concept resource group and Key Vault. Well, this is the managed identity, by the way, that I talked about. Again, it's very simple to configure, and it has permissions to access Key Vault. It has permissions to access Key Vault. Let me switch to Key Vault now. I think I'm reusing. I'm using a Key Vault from another resource group. So I'm going to skip that one because that might have like other information that I might not want to show in this call. but in Azure Key Vault, you configure your certificates as well. You have to trust me on that one. Let's see. I think we're done. Let me check very quickly if we missed something from this list. No, I don't think so. Are there any questions so far? No. One last thing that I want to mention is that I would encourage all of us to keep learning more about Azure. Azure has a lot of resources, and if becoming a cloud architect is one of your goals, there are a lot of resources. For example, in YouTube, a lot of what are they called, like podcasts that you can listen to, weekly podcasts where they talk about how to provision API management, how to work with subnets, or Azure has a lot of offerings. Like, I don't know, maybe it's more than 100 resources. So I would encourage you to, if you're interested in becoming like a cloud architect, in listening to those YouTube videos and learning on your own, because any Azure component does not work alone. For example, if we have a web app, it usually goes hand in hand with Azure SQL or with Key Vault, and sometimes you need virtual machines, which most of us have used. So with Azure, there's always room to keep learning. So I hope you enjoyed this talk. Sorry. If there are no questions, anyone, I'm gonna stop the recording, and thanks everyone for joining. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Rodolfo. Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much, Rodolfo. Have a great day.